This is such an amazing book. I'm learning so much. I mean, there's parts of the judicial system that I don't know, and now I'm learning.
Well, if we haven't had personal experience with it, I don't think we do, but this is just unbelievable.
Yeah.
There's a new book I just heard interviewed, the author interviewed on NPR called The Buddhist on Death Row.
Wow.
And I just ordered it because it talks again about somebody, people called him a sheep and they were the wolves. And the wolves had to protect this particular sheep because he was doing so much good in prison to at least give them some kind of solace and comfort.
Yeah, I was actually spent 2 years in prison ministry when I was in seminary. I was the Protestant part of a Catholic Protestant ministry, and we went to a medium security prison in West Concord, Massachusetts. Did all kinds of stuff, mostly religious programming with inmates, but just getting to know them as human beings also. It taught me a lot. I'm grateful for that opportunity. We never talked about, the crimes. I think that's something you let them bring up to you rather than ask them. We did a lot of work on sort of psychological, emotional, spiritual stuff about forgiveness, about maturity, about taking steps to just have more confidence in yourself and love for yourself and others. Mm. It was that kind of a ministry. Wow. I would like to just welcome the moment, welcome the opportunity to be together, welcome the spirit, welcome each person to the circle. I'd also like to do a share screen here. Can you see the syllabus? I just wanted to point out our objectives. Explore the personal, intellectual, spiritual, and social themes in the book, how they inform our view of the criminal justice system and its impact on people of color. Consider how these themes speak to our spiritual lives and to our lives as citizens, especially in the era of Black Lives Matter, and to build community among those who attend. How's that sound?
Perfect.
These values and expectations are kind of carried over from one WCC reads to another. Do our best to read the pages. And I like, whenever I read a text, to both read it as sympathetically as possible, trying to really get inside the author's mind and appreciate what they have in mind to get to us, but also to read it critically at the same time, to give everybody a chance to talk who wants to build a community where it's safe to express any and all comments and feelings, especially if we can be vulnerable with one another. That's always a gift. And to recognize that we are all learners, all growing, and we teach and learn from each other. And I would today like to focus a little bit more on the questions that were provided in the handout. Each question was like several questions in one. So maybe we'll try to focus on just a number of them. But before we look at the questions, I did want to point out a wonderful reference that Junia passed along to me from the August 6th Chicago Tribune, page 17. I don't get the Tribune, but I found it today online, so you don't have to pay for the Tribune to read the article. How Governor Pritzker is seeking, seems like a fundamental overhaul of the juvenile justice system.
And one of the things he was trying to do was to have children be in a different kind of prison system than adults.
Well, I thought there already was a division, though, between children and adults, but I think he wants to make the age higher. Isn't that what the situation is?
I think he wants to have more appropriate housing for younger criminals.
Yeah, they were talking about 11-year-olds being tried as adults. I mean, that's ridiculous.
Well, that was in the book, wasn't it?
No, it was in the paper.
Okay, here in the chat area, I have pasted this link, which I think you might, if you go to the chat area, you can pull off, or you can just go to the Chicago Tribune website. As I recall, it was, as Junia just said, an article about how Governor Pritzker is basically shutting down all the existing juvenile detention facilities in Illinois, which interestingly to me, as someone from central Illinois, there are none in the central part of the state. They're all in the north and the south. So if you're from my hometown, you'd either have to come up here or go down to southern Illinois, which is part of the problem. The article pointed out that the current system makes it more difficult for kids to see their families because they're often placed far from where they live. And the prisons, the detention systems kind of mirror adult prisons. And they're much less home-like, much less conducive to emotional growth and so on. And the new juvenile justice system will be in smaller home-like settings. Is that, Junia, is it, you remember that?
That's right. And you know, when you see children, so many of these children, even the ones we've read about in this book, have had a horrible childhood.
Yeah.
If they can be brought back and given some strength and things that you did and that you talk about, Jeffrey, they can become productive people. And
I feel the same way. I think that there's a good chance the kids could be rehabilitated more so than with a 60 or 70-year-old entrenched criminal.
And even some maybe young adults could be if they weren't just incarcerated totally.
And do I remember right in the article it said that there were something like up to 1,000 or so juveniles in these systems, and that the governor has reduced the number to only a dozen or 2 dozen as it's transitioned to a more smaller group-like setting and closer to where the juvenile lives so that the family members can visit. Anyway, it's a very encouraging article. And it shows yet again, there's just so many pieces of this criminal justice reform that really needs to be done. And we touched on a lot of them last week, but this juvenile justice is another one.
So the thrust of the article is that kids are, it's not that they're closing down the juvenile centers and sending the kids to adult centers. They're sending them to something more appropriate.
Yeah. The article said that the existing juvenile detention centers will all be converted to adult prisons for adults, and that the juveniles who are wards of the state and who are in need of some kind of detention and correction will go to smaller, more family-like group homes where they'll have bunk beds. And well, if you want to take a look at some of the questions, I thought that the first 6 were all good. The first one we talked a little bit last week is Bryan Stevenson remembers his grandmother telling him, you can't understand how important things are from a distance. You have to get close. And in talking about the juvenile justice system and other parts of this, we realize that a lot of us don't have a lot of familiarity with it because we or our own kids or our nieces, nephews, and friends and loved ones are less likely to have been incarcerated. So there's a lot we don't know. And what do you think about Stevenson's observation that to make a difference, you really have to get close to these situations?
We don't really have the opportunity to ourselves really much to get close unless we visit the prisons. But I think this book and Bryan Stevenson's book brings us up much closer. And reading other texts like this would be to do the same thing. And also, when we had Arnie Duncan bring up that group from the south side, the prisoners who were helping each other to be rehabilitated, that was a more of a personal, up-close situation. But I think, you know, our church is rather special in doing that. I don't think that's very common on the North Shore or other places in small towns.
What are some examples from the book about how Stevenson chooses closeness to his clients and to their family members?
He visits them. He spends a lot of time with them.
Yeah.
He listens.
I thought that the two aunts of Vicky Pittman's, the Ansel and Moselle or whatever their names were, said they had never been at all, had been visited or even talked to, and he spent 3 hours with them. I thought that was very telling.
Not only that, but he drove a long way to see some of these people. And
Right.
sometimes when he was exhausted and it was late in the day.
That's right. He just felt he needed to be there for them, and he was.
I was just telling some friends about reading this book, and they said that there's a documentary. We saw the Just Mercy movie, but there's a documentary with him in the movie. With
Brian.
does anybody know about that? And they said that he's laser focused.
Well, he does appear several times in the documentary 13th. You know, he's a very prominent figure on all these issues. He probably appears in a lot of documentaries and so on, my guess. But if you get the name of it, Jane, pass it along.
Yeah, well, I'll ask about it.
Yeah, thanks. Stevenson also makes the point in the book that getting close to the incarcerated and their family members is actually critical for building a better case for appeal, because you really get a feel for the environment, the situation, and you pick up little facts here and there that can be critical in building a case for appeal.
But also, he mentioned in his discussions, because he spent a lot of time with Walter McMillan, and he said, you get to know a person's character and through their stories and what they say about their lives and how they think. And I think so that motivated him more when he felt that Walter McMillan was a very honest man. I know he had his faults, but I think he had an excellent rapport with Walter McMillan.
And that's why he tells his story through the entire book.
Yeah.
I love the way that he does that.
Yeah, comes back around. Yeah.
Comes back around, right? Exactly, Carolyn.
Yeah, there was
other stories too.
one chapter today that was all about how some teenagers in the country have been convicted and sentenced to basically life in prison till death. He gives those 3 examples. So he goes away from the McMillan story to tell that story, and returns to the McMillan story, as you say. I don't know if it's current law in the United States that a juvenile can be convicted of a crime and sentenced to life in prison. I don't know.
What does it say there?
This book was written in 2014. The law is always changing. And
That's true. Yeah, yeah.
But this was Alabama, and they had some, the fact that the judge could override the jury. There was a number of facts that he said that only in Alabama were these things, occurring.
yeah, that was one of the issues, that a judge could overrule a jury's determination on life imprisonment for someone convicted of capital murder.
Right.
And the judge could say, no, that's not good enough. Well, then why are you consulting the jury in the first place?
Yeah. If I was on the jury, I'd be, why am I here?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think he did that something like 111 times between 1976 and the time the book was written. So
It's a lot.
Occurred a lot at that time.
So again, I wonder if that is still the law of the land or not.
How can we find out?
I think you really need to consult an expert on these things. You can do your own research, I'm sure.
Like Jan Schakowsky or Robin Gable would know.
Interesting.
Okay, I'll try to contact them and see if they have an answer.
What's the second name?
Robin Gable, who's our state representative.
Okay. And in our federal system, you can have rules that apply at the federal level that are different from the state level and so on. And it gets to be pretty complicated.
Somebody from the Appleseed Project at Northwestern would know. And there's also a lady And you have Jan Goldberg, who heads the criminal justice group for the League of Women Voters of Cook County. And she visits the courts and talks to judges there. And she might be a source too, and I can send you those two names. Appleseed, the Appleseed group and Jan Goldberg.
You've probably heard of the John Howard Society, or you may have. It's a prison reform organization. I think they are headquartered in Chicago. John Howard Association, yeah, 70 East Lake Street, Chicago. You know, it's not too late for me to reach out to them and see if they have a staff member who might be able to join us next week or even the week after that.
Well, that'd be cool.
Wouldn't that be great?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're a leading light on the issue of trying to continue the effort to reform prisons, which was started, you know, way more than 100 years ago by churches in the social reform movement in the late 19th century that started things like public education and stopped, tried to address child labor and things like that. The whole Jane Addams movement to make society more humane and on. And the prison reform movement was part of that. And the John Howard Association is probably the best known organization that I know. So maybe I'll give them a call and see if somebody from their staff could join us.
That'd be awesome.
Great.
Yeah.
I wonder if, do they work nationwide? Would they have any more information about what's going on in some of those southern states that we're reading about in this book?
I think John Howard Association is a national organization. It just happens to be headquartered in Chicago. Yeah.
On the closeness that Stevenson finds with Walter Macmillan's family energizes him as well, and deepens his commitment to leaving no stone unturned in Walter's case. And in the first, I think this was either in the introduction or the first chapter, when Stevenson goes as just a law student to tell Henry that he will not, his execution date is not imminent. And Henry starts to sing the spiritual that reminded Stevenson himself had sung that spiritual in his own church.
Right.
And so that the power of the connection through that spiritual is just life-changing, Stevenson says, for himself.
Yeah.
So closeness, indeed.
And I don't know if he ever says it this directly, but I wonder if sometimes working with these folks, if he thought this could be me.
Oh, I think he does. That day,
Very much so.
he was, sitting and listening to his music, and all of a sudden,
Ups are there. Yeah.
But he grew up with some disadvantages of his own there in Delaware, I think it was.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Personal and racial systemic racism, and he saw it maybe more, I don't know, stronger or more obvious in the South, but nonetheless, I think his own story informed his commitment to the cause.
And I was interested that he would get a call or a letter from somebody said, "Mr. Stevenson, you have to come, you have to see me." "Oh, well, I'm so busy, I have to do this, I have to do that." And he would always let everything go and visit those people. And that was his kind of person that he was. I thought that was fabulous. And then he was able to get money and get more people involved.
Mm-hmm. I've had some community organizing training, and one thing we community organizers are urged to ask people is, what do you want to work on? It's not we bring an issue to you, but what's within you already that you want to work on? And when you ask people that question on a one-on-one, they'll tell you, for example, maybe they've got a cousin with an intellectual disability who has no place to live, or who's living in their parents' basement or something at the age of 43. They'll tell you stories, And you'll quickly realize here's someone who's motivated by their own life to do something. So we're kind of going through the questions today a little bit, JS. We can move on to number 2, which is about defining justice, especially in relationship to poverty. The question, what's your definition of justice, and what's the word just mean in the title of the book, Just Mercy?
Well, you know, you can also take it from the standpoint, I think he says the opposite of wealth is not poverty, but is justice.
Yes.
The
And I
opposite of poverty is not wealth.
It's not wealth, it's
Justice.
justice.
Yeah.
Opposite.
Didn't I say that? I thought the opposite of poverty is
Yeah,
not.
it's okay. I just happen to have it in front of me. I'm reading it. That's all.
Okay. And what it means just, it means, I think, that you have opportunity and freedom from fear and freedom of choice in, well, you know, opportunities for jobs and schooling and housing.
I think of the word, to try and summarize it in one word, I look at it as whole.
Whole.
Whole, W-H-O-L-E.
Mhm.
That you have justice and mercy in the criminal system, in the education system, in the career system, in the pay system. I'm in the process right now of summer trying to scan a 70-page report that the city of New York put out in June about racism in New York City. And the word to summarize that they use to describe racism in New York City is inescapable. Now, well, you wouldn't need a 70-page report if everything was hunky and dory, I suppose. And it's, you know, to hear it from the people who experience it, it's absolutely pervasive in every facet of their lives. And so I look at that as, I don't know how you correct one facet of that problem without having it pop up and another. You have to approach it whole.
Well, it's a multifaceted problem.
Right.
So there are many, many ways. And I get the feeling that our country is finally paying attention to that, but I hope that's the case.
Yeah.
I like Eleanor's use of the word freedom with justice. I think there can be justice in various areas and freedom in those areas, but not in others that we need to work more toward.
Freedom is another good word, absolutely.
Yeah.
The last question, too, is have Stevenson's experiences influenced your own definition of justice? Is criminal justice something the first thing people think about when they think about the concept of justice?
No,
I mean, that's essentially what this book is about, criminal justice, especially as it affects people of color. But I don't know that criminal justice is number one, what comes to mind when we consider that term.
Well, we often think of that statue that you see embellished on the old buildings on the walls of courts where, I don't know who it is. Is it Justice who's
Lady Justice.
and yes,
Yeah.
and there's a scale.
Scales.
She
Right.
holds a balance scale.
Lady Justice, I think it is.
Mhm.
And we also, in just thinking about JS's word inescapable, that's what Walter Macmillan's sentence seems to be, through what we've read so far, inescapable, even though it is totally unjust. And so it's based on, what Sheriff Tate wants. The law is, or justice or injustice or whatever it is based on what Sheriff Tate wants it to be, needs it to be. And and that's a generational thing in, we hope, only the South, but that
Apparently in New York City too, though.
Yeah.
it's one's conviction depends on not the law, but on what someone else needs, has personal need for it to be.
Do we have someone in our congregation who's a judge?
Yes, and she just passed away. It's Brooke Kinnaird wife, Dorothy Kinnaird.
Right.
Oh,
Right.
I was thinking if we had somebody in the congregation who was in the system, it would be fascinating to.
Especially on the criminal side rather than the civil side. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, you might even consider your own social context this week, all of you, and see if you can't come up with somebody who's a criminal defense attorney or judge or prosecutor. I bet you'll think of somebody. Madge, a moment ago, you were struggling with something.
I don't remember. And really it was probably more agreement, or well, I was upset about something that we talked about, but I don't even remember what.
Okay.
But the whole idea of Tate's desires being what rules is upsetting, among other things.
Exactly.
But
Well, he rules.
we've experienced that.
He gets to rule because he got chosen to do it. So in a sense, he's the epitome of what the area wants. The people who put him in that position want.
Are you speaking of Tate at this point?
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, there was something I had to highlight it because it just got me right in the gut, where they were talking about the Supreme Court decision in McCluskey versus Kemp, a case that presented convincing empirical evidence that the race of the victim is the greatest predictor of who gets the death penalty in the United States. The study conducted for the case revealed that offenders in Georgia were 11 times more likely to get the death penalty if the victim was white than if the victim was black. And this was replicated in every other state. And it said in Alabama, even though 65% of all homicide victims were black, nearly 80% of the people on death row were there for crimes against victims who were white. Black defendant and white victim pairings increased the likelihood of a death sentence even more. I just find that reprehensible. It just grabs my heart and makes me just want to, I don't know. It's really hard for me.
Did we talk last week about the problem with plea deals? That whenever you go very far into this subject, you come to the issue of plea agreements. A lot of people who are charged with crimes, whether they're guilty or not, if they could go to trial, they might have a chance of being found not guilty. But they have to weigh that against an immediate plea deal, which is for a much less serious crime with a much less serious punishment. And so often they get a very strong pressure from the state's attorney to plead out.
Right.
When maybe in their best interest would be to go to trial. If we do have somebody who knows a lot more about this than most of us do, I think that's something that's be important to look at, because plea deals are not always in the best interest of the defendant.
Well, and then you also hear the stories about how, you know, people are held, you know, and broken down until they've confessed to something they didn't do, just to get away, you know, to have it end, because they're held for days. And, you know, they feel like that's the only way they can get out of there, is to say they did it when they didn't. And I think that's just horrific.
There's another thing going on now, is somebody would know the name of it, but so that somebody who is poor and can't pay the bond doesn't have to stay in jail until their trial starts. I mean, here they are presumed guilty until they're proven either innocent or guilty if they have to stay in jail. And I think someplace in the state they're working for that.
Yeah, we talked a bit about that last week. It's the Coalition to End Money Bond is
Money bond, yeah.
Is a Chicago group. They actually made an appeal to Winnetka Congregational Church for some support. The United Church of Christ congregations on the North Shore had committed to try to raise some money for this organization in the name of the UCC churches on the North Shore. And we're not a UCC church, I know, but the 3 pastors belong to this group of UCC clergy and churches. And then the pandemic struck. And so I did forward this information to Jeff, but I don't know that he's had a lot of time to consider it. But there are efforts out there, accused person by accused person, to try to make sure that nobody's sitting in jail just because they can't afford the money bond. And this article, Ginia, that you sent me about from the Tribune about Pritzker, it said that there was also a bill in the General Assembly in the spring to address the issue of money bond in Illinois. But because of the pandemic, the bill never made it through the committees and so on to the legislature. So yes, there is an effort to eliminate money bond, because otherwise the people who can pay get out and wait for their trial, and the ones who can't stay in jail.
And Jeff, along those lines, have you heard very much more about diversionary courts? Because apparently 1/3 of those incarcerated suffer from mental problems and addiction. And there is at least one town in Illinois where they have a diversionary court system.
Yeah. Here in DuPage County, where I live, we have a mental health court. And it has its own judge, its own, people work it. And people who have committed crimes that are related to mental illness can be sent to mental health court. And rather than running through the regular system. And then one of the outcomes of a case can be treatment rather than incarceration.
Why isn't that being done everywhere? Wow.
Good question.
You talk about the racism in New York City, but do you remember this? I think was he a police chief by the name of Burke?
Oh, yes.
That was indicted, I think. I don't know if they were trying to indict him because he would coerce so many people that they had arrested into making confessions of things that they didn't do.
Yeah.
There were hundreds of those confessions.
Yeah.
So his name was John Burge.
Burge.
Was a police commander in Chicago in the 80s and 90s and maybe before then.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember coming back from Africa in 1994, and I got connected with a group of black and white gay men working together. And we kept hearing from our black brothers, we kept hearing this name, John Burge, John Burge. And nobody else knew about it except the black guys. That was before he was arrested. But he ended up not being arrested for what he did. He was arrested for perjury. And he retired with his pension in Florida and died. But yes, there were hundreds of people arrested by the Chicago Police Department based on confessions that John Burge and his guys had beat out of these guys.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I don't,
confessions.
yeah.
Yeah.
Eleanor, I don't pretend that I have no idea how to compare what goes on in Chicago versus New York City. It just happens that I came across this report that happened to be released by the New York City Commission on Human Rights 2 months ago, without a press release, which gives you an idea about how much they wanted people to know about it.
Mhm.
And I applaud who's ever on that commission for actually putting it together and being as thorough as they were. I don't, for an instant, think that one can point fingers, other northern cities can point fingers at New York City and cast stones, as it were.
Question 4 is about sort of how history affects the present. It says, Stevenson writes that there are 4 primary institutions that shape conversations around race and justice today: slavery, racial terror, and the threat of violence against people of color, Jim Crow, and mass incarceration. And a question for us to consider: how do we see the history of racial bias in the United States impacting prisons today? I'll repeat that. How do we see the history of racial bias in the United States impacting prisons today? How does past meet present?
Could you repeat the 4 again?
Yeah. Slavery, racial terror, and the threat of violence against people of color, by which I think he means lynching and so forth. Number 3, Jim Crow laws, the formal laws about segregation. And number 4, mass incarceration. You know, the fact that we have more people incarcerated per million in the United States than any other country on earth. So how does that history affect prisons and the criminal justice system today?
He really should add another one, and that's the inability to vote, which is seemingly not. Yet maybe that's an offshoot of Jim Crow laws, but that the way you describe Jim Crow laws as, you know, colored drinking fountains and things like that, but the whole sort of systematic approach of limiting the power of the impoverished and African Americans to vote at all in these southern states is really quite pernicious.
And that goes all the way back to the history of slavery in this country.
Yes.
So that was another piece of that too.
And it isn't just southern states. I mean, Milwaukee had what, 5 districts open in their primary in the city?
Yeah.
Maldistribution of resources, and deliberate maldistribution to prevent people from voting.
And also racial profiling, which is a current, is
Yeah.
certainly happening all over the United States.
Absolutely. Career. I mean, what white people can get away with doing or saying to an African American that they can't get away with saying, or much less frequently get away with saying or doing to another white person. And there's an institutionalized behaviors stream that gets to how you get treated in a store, how you get treated on the street, how you get treated if you're walking in a neighborhood where you quote shouldn't be, or I mean, there's all of that plays into it. How all of that plays into how people get treated in prison, I don't know that I could specifically connect the dots, but except to say there's still so much going on from our past history, perhaps coated with a nice shiny veneer. But in prison, you don't need to keep a veneer on. You can strip it off and treat them as you decide you want to treat a prisoner.
One of the horrible things about this is the way that some of those prisoners were treated too by the guards, by other prisoners, but also by the guards,
Yeah.
who should have been professional in the way they treated them, but they were awful. So if you talk about defunding the police or refunding the police or doing things, you need to refund and retrain the guards too, I would think.
Good point.
But you know, they have a very difficult situation in a prison. It's not, so
Well,
all
sure.
prisons are, there's different kinds of prisons. There's maximum security, minimum security. I think probably a minimum security, which has a lot of political and corporate prisoners, they have no problems, but not very few, and they're different kinds. But in some of these maximum prisons, it's a very difficult situation. And there's a lot of fights, and there's a caste system or case system among the prisoners themselves in many of these prisons. And it's, a young person going into these prisons can become a hardcore felon in a way. I hate to say use that term, by their experiences in these prisons. It's their hellhole.
The poor young guy who was raped the first night he was in prison.
Right.
Right.
I mean, that was a horrible story, and nobody prevented that. No, it's just,
That's not an uncommon occurrence. And
I
that-
know, and that's why I'm saying. Anyway.
I saw the first 2 or 3 episodes of The Chi, CHI, on
Yeah.
show, what is it? I don't know my
Showtime.
Showtime, yes, Showtime. It's called The Chi, CHI. I watched the first 2 or 3 because they were free. And it's about sort of life on the south side of Chicago. But one of the characters is a white police officer who tries, against the culture of the police department, who tries to really understand each suspect and witness, African-American suspect and witness that he encounters, tries to understand them as individuals. Whereas all of his colleagues are saying, he's obviously a gangbanger. He's obviously guilty. Just bring him in. He's like all the others. And this guy is like, he's trying to understand who's their family, how do they spend their time. And the story is about a young guy who gets caught up in a shooting and ends up near the body with the blood of the victim on him. So everybody else says that he's guilty, bring him in. He's obviously done it, just keep asking him until he confesses and so on. But this one white officer does actual research into the life of this kid, who says he was actually in the neighborhood because he was trying to feed a dog who nobody else was feeding. And all the other officers were rolling their eyes like, oh, that's a very creative answer. But this one police officer actually finds this dog and corroborates the story with another witness. And I think what it showed me is that it's so easy, if you are in the system, to get caught up in a culture where you're supposed to believe and have certain things and have an attitude about people. And how difficult it is then, and how much flack you get if you go against that system. Because suddenly this white officer found himself not invited to the gym, not invited to the parties with his fellow officers. He was becoming a pariah because he had a different approach to these cases. To me, it was very eye-opening.
In the school I taught in Chicago, when I first arrived there this is the last school that arrived there in 1997, we had a paid guard who was not a Chicago policeman. And then we started having Chicago policemen. And they were of different backgrounds, but one of them, who was a huge one, who looked like a fullback from a football team, said that their group from their precinct had a party at a country club, and they trashed the place so badly that the country club would not allow them back. Now, if they have this kind of mentality and behavior for their own parties, do they have any respect for people that they might be arresting? It's a very bad situation, and I really think that it's so important in any police force that you weed out these policemen who have a number of complaints against them. I think it is like having a good teaching staff. It is essential to have policemen, officers who are have a fairly high moral caliber, are very well trained, and that's where the money should be going into, instead of paying overtime. And I think the whole situation needs a complete relook. But I wonder how you all feel about, this is the first time in history that the top three people in the police force, Chicago police force, are Black. And is this good, bad? Or, I hope they're very capable people. And I know this David Brown, is he from Dallas? Is that where he lives?
Yeah.
I think I read in the paper that he said that what they were trying to achieve through the consent decree, because of the looting and the burning and other problems they've been having, has to almost be thrown out the window, because they have to start over again, because they have new problems that were unforeseen before. But it's a major problem, and I think a lot of the problem has to do with the police force as well as the judges. So that's my piece.
I remember when we were raising our grandson, going to school and being like the parent of the day, and a police officer, some police officers came in to talk about what they do. And the first thing they said is, well, here's what we basically do. We get the bad guys. And I thought, at the time, well, I guess that's good. You get the bad guys. And then I thought, especially rereading Stevenson's book, it's like, imagine you're driving, you're on patrol. That's your attitude. That's your attitude about the people that you're working among, is that you're going to get the bad guys. And then you get a call, go to this corner. There's, there's a suspect there. You approach that suspect with that frame of mind, not as a fellow citizen, but as a bad guy. Your mind is made up that your relationship with a fellow citizen is adversarial, rather than
Isn't their motto to protect and preserve or something like that?
serve.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, in most schools, they have an officer friendly who comes in, and says, well, if you're in trouble, you're worried about that something might happen to you, go up to an officer and ask them to help you. But I just am very concerned about the Chicago police, because I know they have a staff of about 12,000, I believe. And I know several years ago, there was a lot of complaints by African Americans and Latinos that they were not selected, even though they passed the exams. And I think with, the Fraternal Order of Police, is it the FOP? That's the union, I guess, the police union. And there's such entrenched beliefs there. I know the head of the union was aligning himself with President Trump and for more law and order. But they really need a complete overhaul. And I wonder what's going to happen with this David Brown. Is it David Brown and Lori Lightfoot? I guess with the looting situation the other night, they closed the entire downtown area and raised the bridges, because there's so many residents down there now along the Gold Coast and downtown area. But it's going to be interesting to see what happens.
And my point is, I think police officers need to regard all citizens as fellow citizens,
Right.
and not regard any of them as bad guys.
So if one of us does find a criminal lawyer that's willing to speak to our group, I guess we would not have him at the same time as the man from the John Howard Association. So if he was willing to give us like 15, 20 minutes of his time on Zoom, then we would maybe include him possibly in another week.
Yeah, if you find somebody, reach out to me, and they're willing to come, we'll fit them in. Or we'll have a special session or something.
When you say they're willing to come, willing to be on Zoom from wherever they are in the United States right now.
That's what I mean. That's what I mean. Yeah.
A retired criminal prosecutor who well, still lives in Winnetka, but it might be in Florida right now. So probably not.
There's one who's just been appointed a vice presidential nominee. I wonder if we could get her.
Yeah.
I think she'd be very careful what she had to
She's
say.
probably very busy.
Yeah, she's got a few things going on.
I have to turn the recording off, probably. The next question was about improper legal representation. That is presented in the book. Examples of people representing clients on high-profile cases that probably should not be attorneys at all, or don't give good representation, and jury selection, and how issues of jury selection come into play. Do you have some examples of that from the book? What do you think about that?
Well,
Some of the paid prosecutors were paid a very little bit and therefore did a very little bit of work. Or some of the public defenders, excuse me.
Defenders. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And therefore did very little work, and they just sort of let it go.
But they denied all, I guess I forget what the term is when you are interviewing possible jurors. And they did not let any of the Black people, even though a county might have 60% or 75% even of, the 75% of the population, or 60% might have been Black, and yet they ended up with no Black jurors on their cases consistently.
It's supposed to be tried by a jury of your peers.
Exactly.
Isn't it's a profession now to be a consultant to jury selections, right? Isn't that?
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Talk about that more, Jane.
They have people who specialize in psychological profiles to determine how a person might vote, given certain preferences in their background and life experiences, and they actually work with the lawyers to help with the jury selection. I know on a jury I was on once for a theft case, they wouldn't accept anyone who had ever worked in a store before on the jury. And the reason given for that was, if you worked in a store, you know that there's something like a 20% theft rate in stores, that theft is common. And they didn't want anyone on the jury to know that. Now, is that correct or incorrect? I don't really know.
I'm going to take this.
But we were told that by the bailiff after we were chosen in this trial. I thought it was very interesting that jury by your peers. It used to be peer actually meant somebody who was similar to you. Now it means people who have absolutely nothing to do with you. It's completely 180 degrees different now. So and of course it can be toyed with, as we've seen here, in a racial way.
Have any of you been on a jury?
Yep. It was a horrible experience. It was a case where somebody, the person that was being tried, had multiple things in his background that he had done. And the prosecutors, it was the opposite of what you're saying about the public defender. The prosecutors, he came in, you could tell he wasn't prepared. He looked harried, and he didn't do the job. And the judge kept saying, beyond all shadow of doubt, you have to be able to prove beyond all shadow of a doubt that, this guy did this, and the prosecutor didn't do that. And so we sat there and we knew he was guilty, but we didn't have all the proper evidence that could let us say that he had done it. And so we went in and we, did a not guilty. And some person that was in the audience said, "Oh, you want to tell him about the fact that he raped that 3-year-old boy now?" And I mean, I just left there going, oh, I just was sick, because our justice system just completely wasn't what it's supposed to be.
Because he was trying for one thing and they couldn't bring in other things that were.
Right. Yeah. And so it turns out, you know, that not only what he was there for, but he'd done all these multiple other things that, you know, we didn't know about, that, you know, would have had an impact. Anyway, it was horrible.
So your point is the prosecutor was not on his game.
Right. And he was obviously overworked, you know, he was, you know, a public whatever, and didn't do his job. And so we couldn't do anything but what we did. And, you know, that's frustrating. I was sick for 2 days afterwards. I just couldn't.
Did you observe any racial dynamics in terms of the race of the defendant and the who constituted the jury?
No, it was all white. It was at Skokie, you know, it was just a.
Was the accused white also?
Uh-huh.
So did you feel, I mean, the public defender is usually free, but the prosecutor, who pays the prosecutor, I know if it's a firm or a store, I mean, that's not, you know, or a business, they would pay the prosecutor. But do you think that the prosecutor didn't do his job because he wasn't interested, or because he was afraid of retaliation from the prisoner? Because this does happen.
Yeah, I don't know. I felt like his caseload was way too high, and he just didn't give it the proper time.
So prosecutors work for the state's attorney.
Yeah.
So they are government employees.
Yeah.
Not always, though. Always?
Prosecutor, yes.
Yeah.
In civil courts, it's different, but in criminal trials, the prosecution is represented by the state's attorney.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else on, see, number 5 was just in general about legal reform, which we spent a lot of time talking about. Prosecutorial misconduct comes up in the book. It's my understanding that it's very hard to prove misconduct by a prosecutor. It's just a general impression I have from reading news articles throughout the years. The last question for today is examples from the book about how courts often refuse to review new evidence or grant new trials even when there is new evidence.
I thought it was interesting when they talked about, Stevenson talked about how all the judges in Alabama were elected judges and received, of course, campaign contributions from people. And I just wondered what other means of selecting judges do you find? I know here in Illinois, they run individually, or like in Cook County, but also I understand that you have to make a good hefty political contribution to your party too. That helps to get you into the place that you can run for your judgeship. So I thought that was, I don't know what other states do about selecting judges. It's probably not on, what's the word, it's not the caliber, but their the level of ability. But I thought that was so dominant throughout this book. That stopped the conversation.
I know there was a knockdown, drag-out fight for a Supreme Court judgeship in Wisconsin last year. Does anyone else remember about this?
Yes, I think.
Go ahead. There's been a knockdown, drag-out for almost a decade in terms of how the makeup of the Wisconsin State Supreme Court. And it's not pretty. This last round, an incumbent who, these elections are theoretically nonpartisan, but aside from the word nonpartisan that gets applied to it, everything about it is as partisan as the rest of Wisconsin politics. And a very conservative incumbent was up for re-election. I think they have 8-year terms or 10-year terms, one or the other. And a very liberal woman was running against him. And as somebody already mentioned, many of the polling places in predominantly Democratic areas were compromised. But people stood in line forever in order to vote, and the incumbent was booted out, and this new woman was going to get installed. But there's been rigged elections, lost ballots, things like that in judicial state Supreme Court cases, elections in Wisconsin for the better part of the last decade.
One of the last questions here in number 6 is, should victims' family members be involved in the review of innocence cases?
I was just going to say, it made sense for him to understand the families, especially in Mr. McMillion's case, and to find out that he was actually there when he was supposedly accused. I mean, to talk with families that way.
Yeah.
I think with the families of victims.
Yeah.
Actually, the victim of the alleged.
Right. Yeah, that's what the question is
I'm
about.
sorry. Yeah.
That's right.
The mother and father of the young woman who was murdered.
You know, and it never did say in the book, often when there's a murder of a young woman, sometimes she's pregnant and she's going to be telling people how she became, who made her pregnant, and that could have been a cause of her shooting. But you know, they would never present. They mentioned something about what were the skin? She had fought with this person, and that there was some skin
under her nails. Yeah,
it was fairly poorly, very poor detective work.
Right,
but deliberately so.
Of course, yeah.
I think what's implied by the question is sometimes victims' family members don't have objectivity.
right.
And to ask them, you know, what do you think? Should we retry this person? You can almost guarantee they're not going to be using their head, because in their heart, this is a monster, not a human being. And now you're going to bring up all of our grief again. You're going to open up. They're going to be not universally, they're more often than not, I think, going to be opposed to the introduction of new evidence and new trial, because their heart is has already decided over their head.
Right. They want closure. I mean, they've got closure, they think. They don't want uncertainty to be reintroduced. And
Exactly.
maybe there's someone else out there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and also, even for those who, there are sometimes people, they get convinced by the prosecutor that this guy did it. And they didn't know before then, so they accept the prosecutor's opinion and evidence. And maybe they've said a lot of very hateful things about that individual because they got convinced. To then be told, well, maybe this guy didn't do it. How do you undo all of the feelings that you had and things that you said about this individual if it turns out he is in fact innocent? Even if you want truth and justice to prevail, how do you undo that, both for yourself and the person that you've wrongfully injured, you've wrongfully insulted? Yeah, there's a role for some organization to play when things like this come up, when a case is being tried or reheard, but it's not the court's role. It's somebody else's role to help the families of the victims get through reopening all those wounds.
One of the most amazing things for me was Ralph's, the group therapy that he had that made him realize that he couldn't live with himself unless he did tell the truth. And that, I thought, was one little hopeful aspect of Walter Macmillan's story, that this, even though Ralph was also imprisoned and kind of probably given up on, he wasn't totally given up on, because there was this group therapy, which I assume, I can't remember whether it was provided. I don't think the prisoners organized it themselves. I think it probably was provided through the prison system.
Right.
We should ask you, I know it's getting close to time, Pastor Jeffrey, before some of you came on, Pastor Jeffrey said that during his time as a student, he did have prison ministry as an aspect of his training. So what was your feeling about the prison ministry that you did?
Well, I went in every Wednesday evening with the Protestant Catholic team I was a part of, kind of wondering, what am I doing here? And I always left with a feeling like, this is what real ministry is about. It's just about befriending people, just getting, listening to people and just being with people and connecting with people who need connection. And that's the most important thing you can do in ministry. And that makes it worthwhile. It really did. It really taught me what ministry is about. I'm not there to solve anybody's problem. It's way over my head. But I am there to provide comfort, encouragement, resources, just kindness.
Humanity.
Humanity, yeah.
How long were you with there, and how many people did you see each time? And was it the same ones over and over?
I did it for two years, my second and third year of seminary on Wednesday evenings. Yes, we had the same group pretty much every week. And the second year overlapped with my work as a student minister at a Unitarian church. And I brought what we were doing in the prison to my church members at the church so that they could feel like they were part of the ministry. And I even had some inmates, after they were released, come to the church to talk about their experience, especially in white-collar crime, which is something that members of my rather affluent Unitarian church in suburban Boston could relate to.
Oh.
Just because they could, they lived in the world of business, they could understand about it. And the uphill challenges that a released person has, trying to get their feet back on the ground and get reestablished. So I help, and I even helped the youth group make some connections with recently released inmates. So it was a very meaningful 2 years, but even when I was done at the Unitarian Church in my third year, I continued going out to West Concord on Wednesday evenings. It was just very valuable ministry.
Were you meeting as a group of the three ministers or four ministers that you had? And so you met with all the prisoners as a group?
There were four of us. There was a Catholic deacon, his wife, a young man who's a friend of theirs, and me.
And then a number of prisoners.
Yeah, It's hard to remember. That was almost 40 years ago now. I think there were 8 or 10 guys. One guy, I remember him very well. He had been in prison. He was probably 60 something. He had been in prison since he was 20. Yeah.
And did you have one-on-one time with people, or was it all?
I had both group and one-on-one.
Hmm.
But the one-on-one was not like real private. It was like in the corner of a room with other people.
Hmm.
Any women, Jeffrey?
No, this was a men's prison.
Huh.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are they still segregated?
Today?
Yeah.
I think so. In Illinois, I know the prisons are segregated.
Yes.
And even county jails, there's usually a men's area and a women's area. Yeah.
I think over the last 10, 20 years, the number of women incarcerated has risen dramatically.
Yeah. Right. I do want to thank you all for your participation. And I will reach out today while I'm thinking about it to the John Howard Association and just see if they could give us anybody. And if you could find anybody in your acquaintance who works in any aspect of the system, that would be helpful. Northwestern has a clinic where they do the Innocence Project at Northwestern.
Is that still going? I thought that was defunded.
Oh, maybe it is. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, they had some difficulty. I know when Alvarez was the state's attorney, she claimed that they had, I don't know, had used illegal procedures to obtain information and sued the university.
Oh,
And for the university to, I guess, get out of the lawsuit, they had to, I think, fire the professor or something like that. I don't
okay.
Yeah.
It was a pretty ugly situation, somewhat political in my opinion. I think Alvarez didn't want to look as though that she was in charge of an organization that had illegally found people guilty. And was
I think John Marshall has a clinic like this. I might even reach out to them then. But I thank you all and wish you a good day, good evening.